Hello and welcome to the Authors Hour. My name is Fred Zimmerman and I represent the Friends of the Chautauqua Writers Center. We are an organization that aims to encourage writers and writing on the institution grounds and beyond by both supporting and supplementing the activities of the institution's Writers Center. We do this by sponsoring several events. I'll mention the weekly events first, one of which is the Authors Hour on Thursdays at 12:15. Other events include open mic at 5 o'clock on Sundays up on the second floor of this building in the Prose Room. On Tuesdays at 1:15 in the Poetry Room, also on the second floor, we offer informal critiques. If you bring in one page of poetry or prose, preferably about 10 copies in case we have a crowd. A published writer, sometimes me, sometimes Janae Kostner, guides a discussion of what you've written. Those are the main weekly events: Authors Hour, open mic, and the informal critique. At halftime, I'll talk about some of the special events that we sponsor. But let's get to why you're here, to listen to some authors. Our first author will be Keekee Minor. She was raised in Steubenville, Ohio, and is a graduate of Laurel School in Cleveland, and also Colorado College in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Okay. After graduating, she hitchhiked through Europe and the Middle East before serving as a Peace Corps volunteer in Bombay, India, and many years later as country director for Peace Corps in the Marshall Islands. Her career was in population and family planning. She initially worked for the federal government in OEO, it's at the Office of Economic Opportunity, I believe, and not what those guards in the Wizard of Oz said, OEO, yes, okay. And then HEW, Health Education and Welfare, is that right? Okay, I was trying to remember my acronyms. Before moving to NYC, that's New York City, I've become director of field operations for Planned Parenthood's international program. She has traveled extensively throughout the world, and a few years ago wrote a travel memoir, Minor Odyssey, describing a number of her adventures. Now retired, she spends her summer here in Chautauqua, where her family has owned a cottage since 1947. I give you Keekee Minor.
Can you hear me? Okay. Thanks, Fred. I selected a piece from my first section, which is hitchhiking through Europe and the Middle East. Second section is Peace Corps, and the third is just other travel. This one's called Dateline Berlin, November 1963. We thought you were an East German trying to escape, the interpreter responded. I asked him why East German soldiers had snatched me off the Autobahn at gunpoint as I walked from the outskirts of Berlin to the checkpoint. Had I made it to the checkpoint, my chances of getting a ride all the way to Hanover in the western part of Germany would have been excellent. Because the Autobahn from Berlin ran through East Germany, no one stopped along the way by choice. Didn't anyone see I had an American flag hanging on my rucksack? Even as I said this, I knew it was a weak retort. He said nothing. As the minutes ticked by, the questioning became more of a conversation. I was curious and so asked, how many Americans have you picked up? None, he said. You are the first. His statement jolted me, and in that moment of enormity of the situation in which I found myself crystallized. President Kennedy had been assassinated on November 22nd, 10 days before, and the world was in a state of shock. During stressful and dangerous situations, I tend to withdraw, observe, and stay cool. Following Kennedy's assassination, I felt that I had been successful in distancing myself from the emotional impact others seemed to be feeling. But the comment by the interpreter of my being the first American they picked up had produced a torrent of butterflies in my stomach. I had been hitchhiking through Europe and the Middle East for 14 months. Nobody suggested Berlin as a destination, but I thought because it was always in the news, particularly since Kennedy's Ich bin ein Berliner speech, it was a good place as any to round up my adventures before returning to the States. The last leg of my travels had started in Munich, and it was there that I learned of Kennedy's assassination. The day after his death, instead of hitching to Berlin as planned, I went to the American consulate, a magnet for those not quite sure what to do. I waited in line with businessmen, tourists, and students to sign one of the many memorial books. The mood was one of unsettling disbelief. The rest of the day, I spent meandering around the city, collecting newspapers and magazines. I didn't know German, but the pictures that under the headlines needed no translation. Those who guessed me to be American would invariably ask, what will happen to the wall? Why they thought I, at 22, could give them a rational explanation baffled me. Nevertheless, I reassured them as much as myself that there would be a smooth transition of power and there was nothing to fear. My programmed explanation, delivered from a calm exterior, hid the apprehensive thoughts that raced around in my mind on a track with no finish line. The next day, I trudged to the outskirts of Munich to hitch a ride to Berlin. My father's army rucksack weighed heavily on my 5'2" frame. The American flag draped over the pack had proved helpful in getting rides from drivers who fought in World War II. And I reaped the gratitude of those felt towards the American chief's eyes as I listened to their stories. 18 years before, at the end of the war, the spoils of Berlin had been divided up between East and West. During the 2 years just previous to my visit, the Russians and East Germans had built a wall to prevent those from the East escaping to the West. America's relationship with Russia was far from ideal, and therefore, I found that my last trip to the East German border was and I found it ironic that my last ride to the East Germany border was with a Russian couple. We were unable to communicate verbally, but I interpreted the lift as an expression of condolence. At Hof, 3 German students returning to the University of Berlin gave me a lift. The boys rearranged their books and bags to make a place for me in their well-traveled VW Beetle. After we introduced themselves, they didn't talk much, but instead focused their attention on calculating time and mileage. They explained that it was forbidden to stop on the Autobahn, and that if we arrived too soon, they would be questioned about speeding. If we arrived late, they would be asked why we were delayed, where we had stopped, how long, and why. I sensed that they'd learned from experience. I was tired and glad I did not have to engage in idle conversation to earn my ride. While the car radio played classical music in the background, I meditated on the trees colored by fog, which clicked by with the rhythm of the car. We were stopped at a checkpoint, asked to show our passports, then instructed to get out of the car and go to a small building, where I was questioned about how much money I had. Since only paper money could be exchanged for other currency, I saved loose coins from dozens of countries. My collection of coins clattered onto the counter as I dumped the coins from my purse. Although I found it amusing that the officials took such undue interest in what I considered monopoly money, I kept a straight face and shrugged every time they would hold up a coin for me to identify. My hidden amusement quickly subsided when I realized how fidgety my companions were. They hung back against the wall, stoically checking their watches. I felt sure they regretted giving me a ride, and I was more than a little relieved when we were permitted to leave. Tension subsided as the miles between the checkpoint and us grew. My companions resumed their conversation in German. Although I couldn't understand what they said, I knew something was wrong when the announcement on the radio interrupted the music and their conversation suddenly stopped. What did the radio say? I asked. They seemed unable to respond. I repeated my question and waited. Hans, the driver, switched off the radio and in a flat, tight voice said, "Oswald's been shot." We all knew that Lee Harvey Oswald was Kennedy's alleged assassin, and a creepy silence followed instead of a post-mortem commentary. Listening to the quiet was noise enough for me. I again stared out the window at the trees fading in and out of the slate gray fog, reflecting the mood in the car. I tried to comprehend what sort of country I came from, questioning the rhetoric about America being a peace-loving nation. The year before, in 1962, I had completely missed the Cuban Missile Crisis while biking through Ireland. Traveling as I did, I missed a lot of what was happening in the world, which was okay with me. But there was no escaping this current episode. Like the fog, the news of it was everywhere. The shooting of Oswald brought a surreal element to what I was experiencing, and I felt both present and absent. Gone was the tentative, relaxed atmosphere, and the mechanics of watching the clock and checking the mileage resumed until we reached West Berlin. The boys dropped me off at one of the city's 3 youth hostels. While registering, I was told, "You can stay here tonight, but you'll have to leave tomorrow." The youth hostels in Berlin were popular, and therefore the maximum stay in each was 3 nights. I moved 3 times over the next 10 days and found the relocating as much of an adventure as an inconvenience. I roamed the city freely, realizing not everyone had that choice. I walked through Checkpoint Charlie or took the train to the eastern sector, where the wounds of war from 2 decades before still festered. Bombed out buildings and piles of rubble kept the past present. East Berlin contrasted sharply with West Berlin, which had become a vibrant and prosperous metropolis and where scars of war have faded. Still, Berlin was an island in the middle of East Germany, and feelings of fear and isolation prevailed. One day, while wandering the streets of East Berlin, I got lost and stopped to ask a girl for directions. When she finally thought she understood me, she kept repeating, "I can't go, I can't go." I tried to explain that I knew she couldn't go, but that I could, and that I needed her to tell me how to get back to West Berlin. My efforts were futile. Realizing that communication had failed, I left feeling somehow that I was deserting her. When I turned to wave goodbye, there she stood on a street empty of traffic and people, with a pewter sky and buildings turned to rubble as a backdrop. She appeared distraught, as though it was she who had lost her way. Being able to travel easily between East and West Berlin made me appreciate the freedom I enjoyed and took for granted as an American. My excursions gave that freedom focus, and although the difference between Eastern and Western sectors were striking, similarities outweighed those differences. Earlier in the year, while walking across the border between Jordan and Israel, I felt I was bridging a time warp spanning 2 centuries. Unlike the Middle East, where language, culture, and religion separated nations, in Germany, if somebody in the Eastern section wanted coffee, cigarettes, or some other ration item, a family member or friend from the West was able to send it. There were limitations on how much and how often items could be sent, but the commitment to get supplies to those in the East helped to keep the ties between family and friends from unraveling. With such strong links, It seemed inevitable to me that one day the two sides would again be united. The day after my arrival in West Berlin, November 25th, Rudolph Platz was renamed John F. Kennedy Platz. In preparation for the dedication, stores were closed early. People gathered respectfully in the whispered quiet that filled the squares. It was hard to imagine that Kennedy had spoken in the same setting only 5 months before. The crowds had erupted in jubilation when he identified with them by declaring, "Ich bin ein Berliner." I stood there freezing, listening to the words I could not understand but could only feel. The packed crowd listened attentively to speeches, and at the end of the ceremony, the speeches were replaced with somber silence. Nobody left. I, like those around me, remained transfixed. My earlier thoughts of cheering crowds enthusiastically receiving JFK were replaced with images from a darker layer of history. Hitler, from the same platform, had mesmerized a different cheering crowd. No one seemed to pay any attention to the announcements over the loudspeakers asking the assembly to leave. Perhaps it was the weight of history that made leaving so difficult, or possibly psychological inertia. It was only after the police started pushing people along that the crowd finally dispersed. I fell into step with the one-way pedestrian traffic that flowed quietly down streets already dressed for Christmas. After a week of having used up my time limits in the youth hostel, I moved to the Bonhoff Mission, a homeless shelter located in the train station. I'd slept under trucks and in toilet stalls during the previous month, and therefore found my mission lodging quite acceptable. It was musty, cold, and damp, but within my budget. I left Berlin on December 1st. It took me 4 hours to make my way from the center of the city to the outskirts to the Autobahn. It shouldn't have. I had gotten lost. I'm dyslexic, that's a good trait for dyslexic, and ended up taking the same bus to the same endpoint twice. The population thinned out, and I found myself virtually alone by the time I reached the Autobahn corridor that would take me to the checkpoint. The energy was eerie, but I just kept on walking, trying to ignore the unfamiliar feeling of apprehension. I knew that once I reached the checkpoint, I would be able to get a ride all the way to Hanover. Because there were no other hitchhikers around, I tried to reassure myself that getting a ride would be easier. I often found myself totally disconnected from the rest of the world, which generally suited me just fine. But on this occasion, it felt unsettling. In a thoughtful mood, I became preoccupied in looking for treasures that might have flown out of the car window. My pack weighed over 35 pounds, so I was selective about what I kept. Because it was cold, I decided, when I discovered a beautiful wool scarf on the shoulder of the road, that it was a keeper, and wrapped it around my head and mouth. I couldn't believe its owner hadn't returned for it. Looking up to see how much further the checkpoint was, I saw soldiers in a lookout tower camouflaged by trees. I smiled and waved. They waved back. It was reassuring to see a couple of human beings. But after walking another 5 or 10 minutes, 2 soldiers popped out of the thicket of trees. Each grabbed one of my arms and forcefully escorted me up the wooden incline and through 3 layers of barbed wire fencing. I was more surprised than scared. I didn't try to resist them, but kept asking, "Are you east or west? Are you east or west?" One finally comprehended and said, "East, east, no west here." I was so pleased to have communicated that the fact that they were East Germans seemed secondary. The thicket of trees running parallel to the road had provided ample cover for them. And because I had been so preoccupied with my treasure hunt, they'd never even entered my field of vision. They kept repeating, "Poof minute, poof minute, 5 minutes," which gave way to 30 minutes, 30 minutes. My response, "Ja, ja, 30 Jahre." And this time, it was they who appeared pleased. that communication had taken place. They laughed nervously as they shook their heads, indicating it would not be that long. They appeared ill at ease, which I somehow found reassuring. The two of them ushered me through the trees to an opening where an army truck and another 4 soldiers waited. One of them motioned for me to get back into the truck. Maybe that won't be necessary, I said, as though I was the one in charge. I continued to chat away as I rummaged through my rucksack, found and showed them my passport with confidence. They patiently watched my performance and then helped me into the back of the truck. The truck made the only noise as we bumped along through the cold, damp fog. When we arrived at the compound, about a dozen soldiers were outside their barracks as if waiting for my arrival. Some shouted, "Hi!" I felt conspicuous as one of the soldiers led me and another followed upstairs to a sparsely furnished room where the commander in charge sat behind a large wooden desk. Sitting across from him, I restarted my chatter, this time with less confidence. I again produced my passport, and again, it was not my passport to freedom. He watched me with focused attention, waiting for me to realize that I was not going anywhere. So that's my.
It's all done.
Oh, thank you.
I did not say go to the principal's office.
Which has happened to me.
Okay, what a wonderful mixture of the serious and the humorous, of the personal and the historical. I'm also reminded of one perhaps completely apocryphal story. And some of you, if any of you speak German, you can correct me. But I have been told that President Kennedy was sort of not advised correctly about what to say because supposedly in Berlin, Berliner is a reference to a pastry. And he was proudly proclaiming something like, "I am a jelly donut." Thank goodness the Berliners took him at his intention and not his word. Just a few words about the annual events that the Friends sponsor. Since we are nearly at the end of week 8, can you believe that? All these events are in the past tense, but in the form of an infomercial for the Friends, I will briefly list them. At the beginning of the year, we had a reception for Friends on this very porch for anyone interested in literary arts, beverages, and other light refreshments. We had the Authors Among Us book fair on Vista Plaza, organized by Norma over there. Okay, and then we had another Norma organized event, Robert Keeke's favorite film project in the Hall of Philosophy. Finally, we have the annual writing contest. The awards were presented on August 15th, also in the Hall of Philosophy. So those are the annual events that we look forward to next year. Okay. Our next author is Joan Polishook. She is both an artist and a writer. As an artist, she was educated at the City University of New York and received a BA in art. Went on to be an elementary school teacher, an artist in residence, and a mentor. Her work has appeared in magazines, newspapers, in books, on book covers, in museums, galleries, and private collections. She'll also be at Artists in the Market this Sunday from noon to 4, so you can see her work in person. As a writer, she's put out 9 books, I believe, some in conjunction, I think most in conjunction with some artwork of hers. Today, she will be reading from The Poetry of Barnes and Words on Paper 1 and 2, works in prose and poetry. She currently lives in Pike County, Pennsylvania, with her husband Shelton, who's right there. I give you Joan Polishook.
Okay. Thank you, Fred, and welcome, everybody. It is my pleasure to be here in this famous porch. I'm going to read a little bit from each of the three books that I brought today. The first one is called The Poetry of Barns, and I write that because I am very, very inspired by old barns. They speak to me in a visual language that I'm attracted to. So I'll give you a little, just a little bit of poetry from that one. Painted red boards, white roof, awash in sunlight and shadow, still, silent, lone sculpture, wrapped round in a sea of verdant undergrowth, wildflowers, remnants of wire fence, in the heat of an August afternoon, a Chautauqua country barn. And it kind of looks like that. The other poem I'm going to read is from one of my newer books, Words on Paper. Book 1 is all poetry. And this poem is called Left Behind. The old road looms before me, a steep trail telling its own story, reminder of youth's vigor, easily climbing the hill, hiking 3 miles beyond. Today, driving past the old cemetery, tilted terrain, weathered stones. Then the pond where a duck once swam and a dog barked. Rustic log cabin belonging once to someone famous. A former boarding house, shabby in its state of disrepair. Next, sloping sun-drenched field, autumn's faded grass cut low. Strangely unfamiliar. Slowing down, looking for a white clapboard house with a front porch facing the road where I often sat on an August afternoon sipping lemonade with friends. Gone. Not a trace. House, shed, apple tree, mailbox. Ghosts living in my inner sight. Memories mine. Round the next bend, the pink house is painted gray. There is no flower garden. The years have not been kind to the old road. Desolate dwellings crying out for attention. A forlorn landscape. I opt not to go on. The tick of the clock has tarnished the sheen of fond memories for a hamlet in the mountains. The old road, once familiar, left behind. Now I'm going to read some short stories from the newest book, which is Words on Paper, Book 2. I call this one Eugene's Rock. It was a late summer afternoon, sunlight pouring through the trees of a densely wooded tract of land. Walking through the underbrush along what was once a well-padded down path, and looking about the forest understory and above to towering trees, I could hear the crunching sound of my footsteps and bird trills that filled the air with song. Suddenly, sparkling through the dense foliage, a watery place appeared in the distance. Curiosity drew me forward on a trail that was becoming less clear. Tracing through knee-high bushes, weeds, and stepping over jutting rocks, my sneakered feet ultimately fell upon the sandy shore of a secluded mountain lake. A blinding summer sun shone on the lake's water in this sudden clearing, casting reflections of its earthy surround upon still waters. A dock of weathered wood caught my eye. Its fraying timbers aged and splintered. Once painted red railings, faded and broken, were in a state of disrepair, while a tired old rowboat, filled with water, lay beached precariously, anchored to a rusted metal post. I wondered who had left it there, abandoned like the cabins on the opposite shore. The scene conjured up thoughts of previous times, when the several remaining now unused lakefront cabins were once occupied, like the rusted bungalow of a friend at the beginning of the road leading to this lake. Similar dwellings were summer houses of vacationing folks. Later, hiking back along the rugged terrain to my starting point, I stopped beside a huge rock, a boulder actually, woodland igneous, partially moss-covered, settled within the midst of smaller outcroppings, tall grass, dried leaves, twigs, and fallen branches. Its gray, white, rounded sides gave rise to a somewhat uneven but flat top. The rock was certainly large enough to climb upon, its nearly flat surface conducive to sitting or standing, a natural resting place, I thought, for a tired hiker, or an awesome setting for an inquisitive child's play. Once upon a time, a little boy named Eugene played there, bringing with him favorite toys. It became his special, perhaps secret place to be alone, to make believe, to dream. He climbed to the top and stand tall, a knight surveying his wooded domain. Sometimes perched cross-legged, a feathered band on his curly head of hair, quiver, arrow, and bow at his side. A tribal chief was he. Books and study materials took the place of toys as years passed. Still, he came back to the rock. Youthful days behind him, the place remained steadfastly a haven of peace and contemplation. It was his, and only his, as the initials that he once scratched onto the rock attested to. This was known to me, for the boy's mother told me so. I wanted to especially dedicate my recitation today to a friend, a dear Chautauqua friend who recently passed away. Her name was Marie, and maybe some of you knew her as a cello player in the Chautauqua Symphony. I met her and I wrote quite a lengthy story, and I'm just going to read a few lines from that before I finish today. On famous and impressively large Chautauqua amphitheater, in second chair with her cello, a woman whose upswept white hair and long Victorian-style white gown caught my eye, my artist's eye, that is, the evening I saw her for the first time. The symphonic performance that night, I was intrigued and drawn in beyond the symphonic performance that night as I sat down to my front row seat, not only eager for the sound of music, but totally inspired disposition with the cello in a small journal that I always carry with me. The player, in a long white dress, was the first of many poses to appear in later journal entries and ultimately led to the birth of a new and special friendship. To celebrate her 50th year with the Chautauqua Symphony Orchestra. The orchestra performed to capacity audience as usual that season. I sat in my front row seat with my sketchbook and drew pictures of the other players and the conductor, but someone was missing. I'm going to finish with the last story in the Words on Paper Book 2, called Exit Laughing. You should look on page 46 of the catalog and sign up for the memoir writing workshop. The teacher is very good, suggested the gentleman with whom I was chatting at the conclusion of the literary group meeting I had just attended. Thanks, I may just do that, I replied, as we said so long to each other and went our separate ways. As I walked along the road toward the house where I was staying on my vacation, I mused upon the man's suggestion. Memoir, being a favorite genre of mine, had already led me to publish my first 2 books. I was comfortable writing about things stored in my memory bank. Did I need to take a workshop? Then again, I thought, there's always a chance of learning something new. My curiosity was roused. Decision made. I would inquire about auditing the class the next day. At 9 in the morning, I arrived at the designated classroom, where a monitor who greeted me was sitting at the door. She assured me that it was just fine to pay by the day and accepted my check, commenting that it certainly must be a great class. All I hear is laughter from within, she said. I entered the room and shortly thereafter was joined by 10 others and the teacher, a tall, older, gray-haired woman. Responding to a new face in the crowd, she came directly over to me with a warm welcome and stated, "You will be given an opportunity to introduce yourself and tell all. No secrets here." This is a very revealing class. After all, we are concerned with memoir writing. I mentioned that I was part of a group back home and assured her that I was used to and comfortable with sharing. When it was my turn to speak to the group, I remarked that I had written 2 self-published books. Everyone's ears perked up, and many questions were posed about the self-publishing process. For the sake of class time that day, the teacher decided to schedule a further opportunity for me to outline my experience as a self-published writer of memoirs at another meeting. I accepted the fact that this session was just the first of the remaining 3 for the course that I would attend. The laughter that woman at the door had told me about was pronounced throughout the rest of the week, balanced as well by tears of sadness and joy. It was an emotionally packed schoolroom, men and women writing of their life experiences, barring no hopes. Within the very first few minutes of introductions and writing exercises, prefaced by entrancing tidbits from our learned and charismatic teacher, I grew to feel totally at home with this group of strangers. They were all vacationers like myself from many parts of the country. I was as comfortable with them as I am with the members of my own writing group. The spontaneous camaraderie that developed in that classroom, the goodbyes at the final session difficult for all. Nobody wanted to leave. On that morning, we made sure to exchange email addresses with promises to try and stay in touch. We would hopefully look forward to a repeat experience in the future. Our teacher was 90 years young then and proud of it. She was an esteemed faculty member of a prestigious upstate New York college, where she had been leading her very popular writing workshops for over 20 years. Her expertise in helping others to craft and preserve their life stories continued to keep her classes filled, sometimes to standing room only. There was no doubt about it, the woman had a rare gift. She led her workshop in a friendly, welcoming way. She was thoroughly engaging and funny to the point of tears, and knowledgeable in her craft. This unusual enabler shared stories of her own long and colorful life while giving examples of writing techniques to all of us. Her critique was thoughtful, meaningful, and encouraging. It was a great learning experience, obviously enjoyable for all the participants and our teacher as well. At the last session, we in turn read our written pieces per her daily instructions. The room was again filled with interest, curiosity, laughter, and tears. Our eyes welled up, and we cried when one lady read a story of a sorrowful and harrowing event in her life. Everyone was sniffling. No one appeared to have tissues. Wait a sec, one woman cried out as she rose from her seat at the table. I'll be right back, she called, and flew out the classroom door. A moment or two later, she returned, a long length of toilet paper from the girls' room across the hall in her hand. It was a funny sight to see us ripping pieces of paper for use in drying our tears. It brought out the humor in all of us. We exited laughing. Thank you.
And thank you, Joan. You certainly show that you can paint a vivid picture in less than 1,000 words. Appreciate that. Did want to make clear that both authors have books available for selling and signing. I do just want to remind you of a few literary events before we depart. One, the CLSC Author of the Week, Ryan Busey, will be speaking about his book, Gunfight, not in the Hall of Philosophy, but in Norton Hall. That's a change of venue. Tomorrow, right here, the prose writer in residence for the week, Ryan Amilcar Scott, will be speaking. Next week at the Authors Hour at 12:15, we have some unusual combination. We have poet Jason Irwin, who was once an intern here and now is an established poet, reading primarily from his most recent book, A History of Our Vagrancy. He will be appearing in tandem with Mark Altshuler, who some of you may know as the leader of the legendary Saturday morning short story course. They will be in dialogue about Jason's poetry in particular, and also poetry and literature in general. So that promises to be an unusual treat. I hope you join us then. Thank you for joining us today. Take care. Bye-bye. And you can end the meeting too, and then we'll go on with it.